In this video, I'm going to walk you guys through exactly all the steps that I took to polish these kegs to a perfect mirror finish. This is going to be the first video in a series that I plan on doing about how to do a do-it-yourself homebrew build. I'm going to be following the HERMS method, and I wanted to do the polished kegs instead of buying just like 15-gallon pots, because from what I saw, the cheapest 15-gallon pots you could get were about $100, and I was able to get these kegs for $30 each. I also think that the polished kegs it does look very good with the mirror finish. So, polishing stainless steel is definitely a bit of a challenge, and for me, it's been an interesting but cool task to sort of take on. It's something that I've never done before, and if you're finding this video, you're probably like me, you're looking for advice on how to do this. So I found a few other videos, but none of them I felt really were the best method. Once I tried them, I sort of experimented on these other two kegs, and I think I've boiled it down to now what I think is the best way to do this, as well as I did stumble upon a very good channel called Evans Detailing and Polishing. He doesn't polish kegs, but he does a lot of stuff with stainless steel as well as other metals. And I reached out to him and talked to him, and he gave me some really good advice, which is what I want to share with you guys, so that this doesn't take you forever. It will take you probably 5 to 6 hours in order to do a single keg. And if you were to take them to someone, it wouldn't be cheap, and that's just because of how labor intensive this is. So the first step that I'm going to take is I'm going to use the angle grinder with the strip disc to sort of pull off the initial finish of this thing, even though it's sort of raw or unfinished, if you want to say that. This works good, unlike using something like a flap disc, because it's not going to actually grind down the metal. It's sort of just taking off the finish. And then after that, we're going to move on to using a rotary sander. Ideally, if you could, you would go a rotary sander and then a dual action sander. But if you don't have a small enough dual action sander to keep it sort of flat on the surface, you're going to do more damage than good. So what I did was I just used rotary the entire time on both of these kegs, and as you can see, it worked out just fine. It's not going to be a problem. Just the ideal method would be to alternate back and forth between rotary and dual action. So we started with 220 grit, and then we're going to move through 3 other grits. I did 320, 600, and 800 grit sandpaper. After that, we're moving on to, these are called Airway buff wheels. These follow sort of the same sort of method or approach you could think of if you're familiar with car detailing at all. You have a cutting pad, a polishing pad, and a finishing pad, or in this case, the Airway buff wheels. And then you also have the polishes to put onto them. These 2 kegs have actually only been cut and compounded, or cut and polished, cut and colored, excuse me, sorry, they call it coloring. So I haven't even done the final step on these, and they still look great. I'm sort of waiting until I start to install the fittings and cut them up, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to nick them up and might have to make a few touch-up repairs sort of to the finish. But then once I do, I'm going to apply the final step of the polish to really give them a good shine. But even if I left them as they are right now, I think they'd be fine. What I want to do is I want to jump into some footage of me actually working on it. What I'm going to do is just do a small section, because as I mentioned, it probably takes 5 to 6 hours to do a whole one of these, so I'm not going to record all of that. I'm just going to do a small test section so that you guys can see this works, and then you would just apply the same method to the rest of the keg. After that, if you want to stick around, I will go very in-depth and detailed into some tips and tricks for every step. I just don't want this video to get crazy long right now, because I already filmed it once and then it ended up being like 40 minutes. So I'm trying again because I want to cut down on the time, because I realize not everybody has that amount of time to watch a video. So hopefully that gives you an initial idea. You can see me do it, and then if you do have the time to stick around, I will go very in detail about every step that I took and tell you exactly basically how to get this to this. So I hope this helps you guys out. Stick around, and I look forward to breaking it down after we get through some footage of me working on this keg. I just realized that before I get into actually working on this real fast, a few other things I should mention is definitely do this wearing clothes that you don't care about getting very dirty, and in a space that you don't care about getting really dirty. Ideally, if you could do it outside, but right now up in the Northeast, we just got hit with a pretty big snowstorm, so it's really cold and there's a lot of snow outside, so I'm doing it in the garage. but I have a tarp up to try and keep the garage door clean, and I'm not really too concerned about the floor. So first I'm going to start with the angle grinder. Definitely wear safety goggles. I like wearing gloves as well. I wear my welding gloves usually for this, just because I really don't want to take off a finger or something like that. And I wear a respirator mask. I realize with COVID and everything that could be hard to get, but you definitely want to have the proper sort of PPE when working with this stuff, because it is a very dirty process. So right now I'm going to start with the angle grinder, and then we're just going to move through all the steps. I'm going to do angle grinder, sanding, and then the Airway buff, and just roll the camera so you guys can see the transformation. I think I'm going to do the center section here, so you can see that the paint's going to be going and everything, and we'll get it shined up really nicely. That's it. That was about 12 minutes or so just to do this little section. So as you can see, I mean, it would take a lot of time to do all the other sections, but we have got our total mirror finish, and we went from that to that just by sort of those 5 or 6 steps, I want to say. So now I'm going to break down every individual step, because there definitely is a lot that I did not cover in the sort of intro to this video, and I'm going to start with the angle grinder, but hopefully if you're tuning out right now, this was helpful to you. As you can see, this totally works. No gimmicks or anything. I left the camera rolling the whole time. So thanks for watching, but if you're sticking around, I hope you guys do. I'm going to share pretty detailed how I did each individual step. As I mentioned earlier, for step 1 in this process, we're going to be using the angle grinder with the strip disc. As you can see, it does have some metal on it. These discs will start to wear pretty fast, I'd say. It depends on how much pressure you put it on. They'll get down super flat, as you can see from how thick it started. But they work really good. I like this rather than using some 100 grit, which would be really aggressive, and it does a good job to pull off that sort of initial finish or anything that you've got on the keg to begin with. Not really a ton to say about that, other than just you kind of have to experiment with your pressure on it, I'd say, just because you will notice sort of it'll almost start to look rubbery, and that's sort of the disc, I'd say, dissolving too fast because you're using too much pressure. So sort of just take your time, let the tool work. I pretty much just follow a side-to-side pattern. The trick is, because this thing is not flat and sort of it's all round surfaces, to get sort of into like all of the little areas, I'd say. What I would do for the other ones, or to get the finish that I did on the other two kegs, is just you do top to bottom. I like to work sort of ring by ring, so I built these two little holders just out of wood to kind of hold this thing in place. And normally what I'll do is I'll stuff a towel in on the bottom, so that A, once you do start getting this nice finish, it doesn't scratch as you turn it around, but B, it also sort of prevents the keg from rolling around, as you guys saw was kind of happening to me when I was working with some of the tools. So once you have the whole thing done with the strip disc, then I would say what we're gonna do is we're gonna move on to our rotary sander. And as I sort of hinted at in the beginning, ideally, if you could, you would use a combination of rotary and dual action, but I don't want to ruin the only, not the only, I don't want to ruin, and it wouldn't necessarily ruin it, but it puts dirt and this sawdust, not sawdust, but like metal shavings all over all your stuff. And I use my dual action polishers for working on cars, and I don't want to sort of like cross-contaminate, even though I could clean them off. The rotary does just fine, as you can see. Now sort of the trick with the rotary is that you are using the edge the entire time. It's not flat. You've got it on an angle, and now sort of you can do really aggressive, but what I try to do is keep it almost as flat as you can, because the more aggressive you go, sort of the more it's going to put almost like deep swirls into it, I'd say. And the reason why I did not use your sort of typical 5-inch dual action sander, like a typical sander, is because originally I did do that on the other kegs. I used a dual action sander and I rotated it just like the rotary, but because of that oscillating action it makes, it actually did more damage than good, because you want the dual action to be flat on the surface. So in order to do that here, you'd have to have a sort of small, like 2-inch or 3-inch dual action sander or polisher with sandpaper on it. And I have one, but like I said, I just don't really feel like cross-contaminating and using it for just a little project like this. And the 5-inch one will not work just because of all the curvatures here. There was no way to really get it flat. You can get it flat, but it'll just sort of hit the center strip all the way around, and then you've now missed both of these spots. You're not going to be able to hit this. So I would say do strictly rotary. If you've never had experience working with a rotary polisher before, that could be sort of a tricky task for you to take on, but I would suggest, as if you don't have a proper sized dual action, don't use it, because you're going to do more harm than good, which is what I found out the hard way, unfortunately. So we're going to start with the 220 grit. I would definitely say my recommendation would be, if you are going out to buy sandpaper for this, buy all of the same sandpaper. The reason for that is because all the different manufacturers, they always advertise like our sandpaper cuts better or lasts longer or whatever, and that's because most likely what they're doing is they're making the sandpaper slightly more coarse than they're actually advertising on the pack. So I use 220 grit sandpaper, but that might be more like 175 or 180, but they're listing it as 220, and I'm using different sandpapers. I used the 320, 600, and 800 from the Gold, which I got off of Amazon. I'm going to link all this stuff in the description. That worked really well. I just used the 220 that I had on hand because I didn't really want to go out and buy more stuff when I had already had what I needed. Something to note is that you are going to burn through a ton of sandpaper. So don't, as you noticed or might have noticed, I switched sandpaper with the 220 twice just to do this little section, because it's going to get clogged up really fast. What you can do, and what I have done, is I use the WD-40, and you can kind of wipe it off a little, because it's more like it's clogged. It's not that it's completely dulled yet, but what I would say is just when it gets like this, just chuck it. It's done. I used the WD-40 as sort of a lubricant, because if you notice the first time I sprayed it on, or one of the times, there was steam coming off because it gets really hot. So that WD-40 sort of acts as a pretty good lubricant between the sandpaper and the stainless steel. Then we're going to just move through all of the other grits, sort of following the same process. I went side to side, remember keeping it not too steep on an angle, but not putting it flat. You're sort of working the edge. What you have to be cautious of is, hopefully the camera can pick this up, there's sort of a grain to the metal, I'd say. And it's very easy to get the center parts to get rid of that grain, but it's tricky in the corner areas to get rid of the grain. And what you might find is that if you don't sort of look over and inspect what you're doing as you're doing it, you might get to the final polish and realize that it looks like there's sort of this zigzag grain finish all throughout your perfectly polished keg, and you'll be back to square one because you'll have to go back to 220 because the 320 does not take it out. What you could do is you could skip the 800 step if you wanted to, but then you're sort of making your airway buff work a little harder. So it's really up to you depending on how much time and also the level of perfection that you want to try and get this keg to. I could breeze through this all somewhat quickly, but it won't be that perfect mirror finish that you're seeing here. And I really think that it's worth putting the time in to do it right. So, as I said, 220, expect to go through tons of sandpaper. It's definitely not uncommon that you're going to go through a lot of it. I went from the 220 to the 320, and as you can see, it all sort of ends up being the same. Then the 320 to the 600 and the 800. And then once you're done with the sanding, what I did was I used this odorless mineral spirits. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to wipe off any sort of residue or like this sort of, I guess, metal shavings, if you want to call it that. It's not really shavings, but it's like this fine metal dust that's kind of all over the keg. And I want to wipe that off before we transition into using the Airway buff wheels. And prior to me sort of doing some hunting on YouTube, I had never heard of these things before. And a lot of people just sort of show you them using them, but they don't tell you what they are. So these are Airway buff wheels that I got from Renegade products. Got cut off here. Renegade products. I called them on the phone to sort of get some advice on what to do. And they sent me their catalog, which worked out perfectly because it had a layout or a chart sort of as to what polishes and wheel matching combo you should do for types of metal. So since we're doing stainless steel, what we have was their red cutting wheel matched with the black cutting compound or polish, if you want to call it that. And then next level of that, we had the pink, which is the coloring step, and that's paired with the yellow. And then for the final step, we would have the white paired with the blue, the white wheel paired with the blue compound or polish. And those would be our 3 steps. But as you can see here, I only did the 2 and it came out perfectly. So really what I realized after getting into this was that the 3rd step isn't all that necessary. I really truly didn't see that much more of a benefit when I did it. It maybe gave it more of a sort of a sparkle, I'd say, but it didn't improve the clarity. If that's, hopefully that makes sense to you. Now with these, I am definitely by no means an expert. Like I said, I was going to link Evan's Detailing and Polishing in the description, as well as maybe a few helpful videos. There is a lot to know about these, and I am by no means an expert, but one of the things that you want to have is you want to have a rake. So this is an Airway buff rake, and the reason for having this is, say that you don't do all of this in one sitting, the compound is going to harden inside of your Airway buff wheel, and you're going to sort of need to clean it out. Now ideally with the cutting wheel, you want to sort of keep it as coarse as possible, but like I just mentioned, if you let it sit, the compound's going to harden up in there, so you will have to use the rake on the cutting wheel just to sort of clean it out in between uses. But if you're doing it all in one setting, I would say unless you sort of notice that it seems to not be doing that good of a job, you don't need to use the rake on the cutting wheel. Now on your coloring wheel, you're definitely going to want to use the rake almost, I'd say, in between the times when you add more polish to your wheel, because you want to sort of keep this clean and you want to keep it doing a good job. So I'd use the rake. You just run it and hold the rake alongside, and you'll see sort of stuff fly off, and it will do a pretty darn good job. Now, something to note with these is it does matter which direction you go. So with the polish and the direction of the wheel spinning, if you're going side to side and upward that way, it's sort of putting the polish down and picking it up with the wheel. However, if you're back cutting, which is a technique, and it works pretty well, I'd say, especially with stainless. With stainless, it's totally okay to get the metal really hot to work on it. That's how you're going to sort of achieve your finish, is you want to get the metal warm. So what you can do is one pass forward, and then you can do a back cut, which is you work backwards with your polish, and then you can go up again. And after you've back cut once or twice, I would say for the rest of the time you just go from like bottom to top. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is you might be asking yourself, when do I add more polish or compound? You can see, I don't think the camera is going to have done that good of a job picking it up, but you can see when your Airway buff wheel is turning and there's nothing there. You won't see any of the actual compound or polish being put down. So that's when you need to add more, I'd say. These compounds started out as, this blue one I have is pretty much almost full size, I'd say. And that's how much I've used so far on the other two kegs. I've watched videos where guys polish entire fuel tankers using maybe like 1.5 bars of this. So I would say that this stuff does take you a pretty good ways along. I'm definitely probably using a little more of it than I should because I'm not an expert by any means, but it's working out well. It wasn't crazy expensive either, so that's good. And that is probably the key, I'd say, to getting this polish. You got to have a good sanding job done. I'm not getting this polish, getting this finish, sorry. You've got to have a good sanding job done, and then the Airway buff does really all the heavy lifting. It's just that you have to, it's just a very time consuming process. Like I mentioned, it's going to take probably 5 to 6 hours. But results are totally worth what you can achieve. And this is proof. I did the same exact process on these two kegs here, and they both came out looking amazing. So hopefully if you guys stuck around this long, that was helpful for you. If it is, or if it isn't and you've got any questions, because I know this is definitely complicated, please feel free to leave me a comment. I always try and do my best on my videos to respond to any comments or questions that I get. And I hope that you choose to stick around for the entire series of this build, because this is just part one. As I mentioned, I did the polishing first, and then I'm going to be moving on to actually getting the fittings installed and heating coils and all that good stuff. My college roommate is actually doing all of sort of the electrical wiring for this, so I'm also going to include a video, hopefully, that he's going to make for me on how he built the control unit for this, and a very sort of technical aspect side of it that is not exactly my area of expertise, I'd say. But again, thanks for watching, and we will catch you guys in the next video.